a D major and a D minor, so we were able to sort of, not have these challenges in communication. So I work with Falco. I co-lead our Cultural Heritage Engineering Initiative at the Qualcomm Institute here at UC San Diego, and also co-direct our Scripps Center for Marine Archaeology here at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I am an archaeologist working with very talented student, staff, and faculty from our Jacobs School of Engineering, and that's how I came to know Dom as two people who shared a passion for the outdoors, of getting engineering into the wild, as Falco likes to say, where things break and sometimes you get lost, people get hurt. It's a real proving ground for these ideas. And so Falco talked a little bit, not a little bit, he talked like a really amazing coverage of this whole engineering for extreme environments, talked about engineering for extreme events. We'll talk about something a little bit different here, and that's scanning in extreme environments, right? So I want to just sort of quickly flash to, maybe some of you didn't know that Dom was also a National Geographic explorer, and this speaks to kind of the relationship that Falco mentioned, having him work in our lab when he started here at UC San Diego as an undergrad, where we kind of put our heads together and thought about how we can get some of these technologies into the field in places where there was such potential for discovery. And it's one of the things that I really love about our lab is that Falco's been able to recruit a number of students who are climbers and sailors and cavers, canyoneers, pilots, paragliders. And so we bring this kind of group of young people together who really want to get tech out in the field, capture these amazing places, bring them back to campus, synthesize these digital twins, and help advance science and conservation. So you can check it out on August 2016 issue of National Geographic. So our journey today starts underground, and this was the first project I did with Dom. This was in 2014 in a cave site called Ocho Balas in Quintana Roo. And this was, for me, very early on, kind of appreciating the importance of 3D modeling, particularly structure from motion photogrammetry. And of course, Dom's like very experimental in this early phase of 3D documentation in the field, even bringing drones down into the caves. This was a really spectacular site with a well-preserved late post-classic temple deep inside a cave. And so this was an opportunity to get to know each other, to work together, and to kind of, sort of start our story today about working underground and bringing these technologies underground. So as an archaeologist, I'm very interested in how the ancient Maya conceptualized, transformed, and interacted with subterranean environments. Caves were very much a part of their cosmogram. This was the place of the birth of the gods, particularly the dwelling places of the chalks, the rain gods. Caves are associated with emergence in agricultural fertility. And the Maya very often would make deposits, votive offerings, build temples and shrines inside caves, much like you would see them at surface sites. So if any of you have traveled to the Riviera Maya, been to sites like Chichen Itza or Coba or Tulum, we find those types of features underground, right? So there's this interesting link between the subterranean and the terrestrial. And that's a place that presents certain challenges when it comes to 3D documentation. The reality capture tools that we use to be able to record these places in 3D. And these are the places that I love. I mean, this is, for me, there's no place I would rather be than deep inside a watery cave and potentially with really good people and really good tech along. But this is the challenge, right? I'm really fascinated by the frontiers of human exploration. We think about so much of what we know about the Earth, it comes from terrestrial or aerial or satellite-based technologies. We know more about the surface, even of the moon, than we do the spaces within our own planet. These are places where humans have to go in order to explore. I mean, I'm also fascinated by robotic systems, AUVs, ROVs, unoccupied surface vehicles. We can't really use these effectively in cave environments, despite the occasional news piece that pops up every now and then. These are places that humans have to go to collect data because they're so incredibly complex. And that's what I love. I love going deep inside the Earth with the kinds of tech that are well suited for this type of documentation. It gives us a sort of visceral connection to these places. And I think many of you also would rather be out in the field with QCam in hand than necessarily, in the office looking at a computer screen. It gets us outside. It kind of activates our innately human senses. And I think that's part of the process of documenting the world around us. So what we find, again, underground is what we often find in Maya ceremonial sites at the surface. We'll use a number of techniques, but mostly vision-based techniques, photogrammetry, very often single camera photogrammetry originally to document sites underground that include clusters or offerings of pottery. We see these handprints on the roof of a cave in Quintana Roo that I'm documenting. Also architectural features, shrines and altars. And we'll use not only cameras, but also other vision-based technologies like structured light scanning, which uses a camera and a pattern of light in order to accomplish this 3D reconstruction. So we find the remains of sacrificed individuals. We have another human cranium here that was deformed with pottery vessels. So these spectacular deposits that are really kind of the focus of a lot of our documentation efforts. And so, well, what if we can then push deeper into the cave? Not just looking at objects and features, but rather the entire cave itself. The ceilings, the walls, the floors, the tunnels, the chambers, the rooms. And with QCam in hand, we've been pushing deeper and deeper into these caves, capturing these environments. Wherever we can bring light and wherever we can crawl or climb or scramble or rappel, we can take these technologies along with us in order to capture these spaces. And that's what I'm really excited about, is just moving deeper and deeper into these caves with our QCam to kind of get as much as we can, certainly above the water, right? So we do a lot of work at that kind of air-water interface, try not to trip and fall, drop the battery or the QCam into the water, but we keep going deeper and deeper, capturing these spaces, but then eventually you're gonna have to go underwater. Right? And so I'm a cavern diver, not a full cave diver. I stay a little bit closer to the entrance, but I work with a very talented group of underwater cave explorers that are part of this program of survey that is mapping hundreds of kilometers of now submerged cave passage in Quintana Roo. And you can kind of get a sense of what this experience is really all about, the opportunity to go deep inside caves that were at one time dry, and search for not evidence of ancient Maya cave use, but a period in our history in the Americas that's much, much earlier, right? The Ice Age, the late Pleistocene, early Holocene transition. So when we look at a picture like this, these caves were dry when the speleothems, the stalactites and stalagmites, were forming. And this was not that long ago. It was about 12,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago that these caves started to fill with water. But during the last ice age, these caves were dry. Why? Because much of the Earth's seawater was tied up in the northern ice sheet. Sea levels were up to 100 meters lower than they are today globally. That meant a lot of our coastlines were exposed, like here in California. Florida was twice the size it is today. Same with the Yucatan Peninsula. And people were venturing into these caves. Animals were venturing into these caves. Caves now that require you to dive deep inside to explore. And so when I look at these pictures, I think about humans walking into these caves with torches, right? This is during the late Pleistocene, the Ice Age. Animals, giant animals like saber-toothed cats and giant ground sloths moving through these cave environments. Well, what happens? We have this major event globally where the global temperatures warm, climate changes, the glaciers melt, sea level rise, and they flood places like this, kind of preserving them as these time capsules. What do we find inside these caves? What do our underwater cave explorers on our team find inside these caves? Well, I mean, just an incredible variety of now extinct megafauna, including giant proboscideans known as gomphotheres, much like mastodons, giant ground sloths, camelids, horses, bears. We find them inside these caves. It's incredible. Some of you have been to Cancun, you've been to Tulum, you don't think that underneath your feet you have the bones of elephants. I mean, it's really a spectacular thing. And many of them are found in this pit deep inside a cave system known as hoyo negro. And it's completely dark. This is painting with light to give you a sense of what it looks like if it was illuminated. But think of this as sort of La Brea tar pits without the tar. You have these animals right up to where that diver is, stumbling around in the dark. They can't resolve light. They can't see. They're smelling something. It could be carrion. It could be water. They're moving around inside this environment. They go right off the edge and land down below inside the cave, a death trap, which is an incredible opportunity for paleontologists and also archaeologists to be able to now reconstruct what life must have been like, what animals were on the landscape at the end of the last ice age in the Americas. And what are we finding? These incredible bones, right? So this is a femur and a pelvis of an extinct proboscidean, that Gomphothera I mentioned, that looks like a giant elephant, bones from giant ground sloths. This is Alex Alvarez, and Beto Nava here shining his light on a cave bear. And what's so exciting about this site as well is that some of these specimens are the most complete specimens for these species yet found anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. The preservation is so good. Yes, we have those animals here in California as well, but they're not readily findable like they are in this kind of environment where you have the stasis, the animal dies, sea levels rise, caves flood with water, they become more findable. And humans as well, which is really incredibly exciting. So this is the cranium of a young woman who is nicknamed Naya. She's the oldest, most complete set of human remains yet found in the Americas. She dates to around 13,000 years ago, right? Maybe not that old by old world standards, but certainly old for the Americas. And what's really interesting to note is that for all of the Western Hemisphere, North America and South America, we only have 4 partial sets of human remains that date to a period older than 10,000 years ago. So think about those hundreds of thousands of people living in the Americas. We only have 4 partial skeletons and 1 complete one. So these are incredibly valuable and important discoveries. And it's one that we want to take the technologies that we have that can capture these places and be able to bring this data topside. So I should quickly mention that, obviously I get excited about this because I'm an archaeologist, right? But one of the most enduring questions in American archaeology is, who were the first Americans? Where did they come from? How did they get here? When did they arrive into the continent? And so many of you know that we had a connection between Northeast Asia and the northwestern North American continent during this period at the end of the last ice age. A landmass known as Beringia, and people were either coming by boat or across land in pursuit of game, and humans following animals were coming into the American continent. We want to better understand who these people were and when they arrived. And a lot of that information is tied up in our skeletons, particularly our crania, right, and our mandible. So our skull contains a tremendous amount of information about what populations we represent. I won't go into more detailed explanation because we don't have time, but to be able to capture these data, in this case in situ, underwater, was really remarkable for us. And to use that as an opportunity to then create a 3D print and then use what's called the Gerasimov method. This is a forensic facial reconstruction technique that's very often used when someone's found in the desert and they're defleshed and they're potentially a murder victim, and you want to kind of understand, okay, what did this person look like? We go through this method in order to do a craniofacial reconstruction. And that became sort of the first face of this first American that also appeared in National Geographic magazine in 2015. So it's an iterative process. It's really exciting. It gives us an opportunity to learn a little bit more about who these people were. But ultimately, we have to recover these bones. And so that means that we have the opportunity to do in situ photogrammetry and also ex situ or in-lab digital documentation as well. Of course, we have the benefit of in situ photogrammetry allowing us to create custom cases, so we can very carefully take these bones out of the cave, bring them into different kinds of environments for CT scanning, which gives us volumetric data, X-ray, and then, of course, this is not a human cranium, that's a giant ground sloth, but using structured light scanning for more surface detail. What's nice, and what Falco had mentioned before, is this all follows our digital twin synthesis workflow, where we take all of these different modalities that capture different aspects, surface and volume of particular elements, in this case bones, and we can bring those into a digital twin where they can each be individually consulted. So that's a big part of what we do, is create an environment that allows scientists to go in and extract measurements and the like. So if we look at the challenge of documenting a site like this completely dark, not surprisingly, photogrammetry was the most ideal imaging modality that was deployed, in this case having to throw a lot of light into the cave to do detailed documentation of the cave floor. And what it renders is essentially a multi-resolution digital twin, one that's a mosaic of different models that were imaged at different times and different resolutions in order to help facilitate the process of analysis. So you get kind of a sense of what this looks like. And just like we were looking at power poles and the importance of being able to semantically segment those points that correspond to different components of infrastructure, we do that also in sites like this. So this is a saber-toothed cat, right, Smilodon fatalis, and we're selecting the points that correspond to anatomy versus those that correspond to substrate, and then that allows us to take them into analytical environments to make those measurements, and to be able to sort of extract them and compare them with the crania of other similar species or same species in the same cave. So, you know, just like we might do with a power pole, we're doing that here with the crania of these animals. And then condition assessment, right? Dom mentioned the importance of looking at degradation or delamination, cracking, other signs of damage for infrastructure. We're doing the same with these bones. If we're going to send the divers in to recover them, we want them to be mindful of the fact that the bones may be fractured, they could require special handling. So we do a lot of this assessment of the integrity, the structural integrity of these sites using these image-based data. It's essentially somewhat analogous, where we don't think about, like, well, how do we use these technologies in other kinds of applications? Well, this is an example of something that maybe we won't think about very often. And also, as we know, when we collect data in the field, there's very often objects or parts of objects that we can't see because they're occluded. We can't get our Q cam there. We can't get our camera there. And so very often we will bring some objects topside, image them topside, and digitally reinsert them into the digital twin. And that allows us to sort of think more creatively about how we capture a particular scene in its completeness and its entirety. What's also really interesting that we noticed, and when we just looked at photographs of the site, it was kind of hard to figure out, okay, what's going on? My specialty as an archaeologist is in site formation process and processes, and so I do what's called taphonomy, and that's understanding what happens to humans and animals when they become part of the archaeological and paleontological record. And so what are the forces that act on these organisms when they meet their demise? And what we noticed is that many of the bones of the animals are actually not on the floor of the cave, they're on the wall of the cave. Okay, like, what's going on here? This is really strange, right? So we know that the cave was dry, or we know that sea level had not pushed the aquifer up into the cave yet when these animals fell in, but yet there's evidence to suggest that the cave would periodically flood, and there would be water inside the cave because the nature of the distribution of the bones suggests that it's an animal that came apart or decomposed in a draining cave. Well, why? Well, it wasn't until we were able to do the visual analytics, till we had these image-derived data that we can analyze to look at the spatial, contextual, and even temporal relationship between different bones and skeletal elements, that the picture became clear. So here you have a wall of the cave, you see the scapula, humerus, radius, and ulna of a new species of giant ground sloth, which is actually really cool. And so what had happened is this animal walks off the edge of the cliff, falls into a shallow pool, it dies, its gases expand as it decomposes, it's buoyant. Like pool toys, when you disturb a pool, you wake up in the morning after a pool party and all the toys are around the edge of the pool, right? What's going on, right? When you disturb the water, things move. These bloated carcasses of animals would wind up on the edge of the cave, and then the cave would drain out after the storm, and it would drag this partially decomposing carcass along the craggy cave wall, ripping off pieces of the corpse, and the pieces that are parts of your body that are held together by muscle and tendon, those maintain their articulation and they decompose in situ. And so this whole picture emerges that we could not have been able to reconstruct without image-based modeling, without bringing cameras in, doing the photogrammetry, doing the visual analytics, doing the semantic segmentation, and trying to understand or put together this puzzle that obviously paleontologists get really excited about. So we're talking about this critter, right? Big, giant ground sloth. We have a new genus and species, so people sometimes get excited, we get excited, we find like a new genus and species of a really tiny organism or a microbe. But to find an animal that's this big, that didn't really live that long ago, new genus and species, we got to name it Nhochchichakshilbabaka, which means great clawed underworld dweller in Maya, so that was a lot of fun. And you can get a sense of how big this thing was. But it presented some really interesting challenges for us to do the recovery. And so here's the pelvis of this giant ground sloth. This is in situ photogrammetry of the pelvis of the giant ground sloth. It's partially occluded. And so it required us to sort of match the geometry of areas we couldn't see because we wanted to build something to take it out. And we needed to build a cradle, but then also think about how we're going to apply that cradle to the pelvis to recover it, because it's a new genus species, got to be recovered in order to be described and published. And so we can only image what we can see. We can only reconstruct what we can see. So whatever your cameras can see, that's all you can reconstruct, right? So sometimes you have to get around the backside of something has to be detached or picked up and then re-imaged. So that means we didn't know what the backside of this pelvis looked like. So it would have to be flipped. So we worked with a surfboard shaper here in San Diego to carve it out of Clark foam. We glassed it just like a surfboard, took the foam out, attached it to a board, and we gave it to the divers to bring into the cave and perform this really delicate recovery. And it worked out just fabulously, no damage to the pelvis. Really exciting to have these big bones of a new genus of animal. So where were these animals getting in, right? So this is a puzzle that we're working on with a grad student here at UC San Diego named Lauren Clark. She and I are doing what's called the Human and Faunal Access Study, trying to understand how humans and animals are actually accessing these caves. And what we need to do then is we need to not just explore the areas deep inside the cave where we find the animals themselves, but we need to be scanning the entrances to understand their morphology, at least in a contemporary sense, with the understanding that their size and shape and dimensions change over time. They're getting bigger as a result of inclusion of breakdown, maybe smaller as a result of infilling. They become occluded. And so that baseline geometry is what we've been collecting in the field, going around in the jungle and scanning as many of these cave entrances as we can. I have to say that QCAM is performing very well. No glitches with these incredibly hot, humid, even downright wet and muddy environments. We're getting really good data that we can then tie to our underwater 3D data as well. And so Lauren's been kind of building these representations of these underground spaces, thinking about how animals would have moved through these spaces. And so also trying to get ready for providing these visualizations to our paleontology colleagues so they can start thinking about how to create this sort of model or simulation type environment that allows us to understand human movement and animal movement. So she's working on this technique called mesh cloud, which is uniform spacing of our point cloud to, get a better sense of, or make these environments a little bit more intelligible. And so if we can get them to this sort of ready state, we can bring them into simulation environments. We've been doing that with a program here at UC San Diego called Neurodiversity in Tech. And we challenge the students to take these 3D data of the caves that we have and build a virtual world. And then we have contemporary analogs for these megafauna, like elephants for gomphotheres. And we have contemporary bears for cave bears. And start thinking about running a series of simulations to see where the animals would have fit, right? So when you look at a 2D cave map, you're like, oh yeah, gomphothera can walk from the entrance all the way to this pit. It's like, oh no, you find out that the ceiling's only like 1.5 meters high. It's not going to work. But when you have 3D data, then you understand the morphology of the cave. You can model the morphology of the cave, and you can start moving these critters through the cave, see them bumping their way into. It's very simplistic, but it's also allowing us to ask some interesting questions about how animals use these spaces. So we'll move away from caves briefly and into another project that we're doing at the site of Chichen Itza, and I'll close with that because it's a lot of fun. And so we're bringing our 3D documentation tools, our QCAM and others, into these environments of palaces and temples and pyramids at the site of Chichen Itza because we're creating a comprehensive digital atlas for the entire site. And some of you have probably been there, who's been to Chichen Itza. Okay, you're like, great. So you already know that the site itself is this massive 3D mosaic. These buildings are made out of countless, hundreds of thousands, millions of carved stone elements that all come together like Lego bricks to put these buildings together. And so what we want to be able to do is sort of solve this puzzle. So if you're going to put Lego pieces together, you're looking at two things, right? You're looking at where it's going to snap into place, and you're looking at the piece that you're going to snap on, right? So the two surfaces have to come together. So we need to scan the two surfaces, all of the building facades, all of the individual carved stone pieces, and then in a virtual environment, start sticking them together until they fit, right? And so that's how the column at the top of the Castillo, no one really understood where these pieces were, because you can't pick like a 1,000-pound piece of stone and bring it up to the top of the pyramid and try to stick it into place. They hadn't really thought, it's like, okay, but we can scan them, and we can scan not all the different aspects of them and where they might go. And so this was work done by Scott McAvoy here at UC San Diego, virtually recontextualizing these pieces, which we're also doing at a number of different museum collections and bodegas. It's at locations around Mexico, scanning all these mosaic pieces, these architectural stone elements, and starting to fit them back into place. And this all lives here on one of our platforms at UC San Diego known as Open Heritage 3D. So you'll find a lot of our photogrammetry data there at Open Heritage 3D, and we're ultimately hoping to launch a platform that allows people to sort of help contribute to fitting the pieces of Chichén Itzá back together again. So keep exploring. Thanks to all of you for giving Falco and I an opportunity to share and talk with you today, and feel free to reach out. We're always happy to talk more about what we do here at UC San Diego. Thank you.